Hello and welcome to the International Journal of Paramedicine. I'm Rob Lawrence and I'm talking to Lucinda Sinclair, who's coming to us from down under, close to Brisbane in Australia. Lucinda, welcome. How are you?
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rob, for welcoming me to this little teaser for this article.
Indeed. And so we're excited to have your paper in IJOP. And so, first of all, give us the title of the paper and then actually just give us a little bit of a Lucinda backstory so the readers and the watchers and the listeners can understand who you are and where you're coming from.
Okay. Exploring the experience of Australian graduate paramedics and transitioning beyond the government ambulance services is the title. And my history is I've been in ambulance since the early 90s, doing various different roles. And I joined with Queensland initially and then went down to Victoria and became an intensive care paramedic with Ambulance Victoria, and then started teaching in 2009 part-time, working still on the road. Finally gave up the gloves around 2015 after taking some of my students to Israel and spending 30 days working on the ground in Israel, and then came back to Australia and decided it was time to do maybe a PhD. So this study has come partly out of my PhD research, the information around this particular article.
So just give us the general overview of your paper, and if you like, some results or conclusions, and then we'll sort of just have a couple of questions to bring out some of the points.
Well, my initially this research started off with exploring how graduates transition to practice and whether or not they were prepared for practice was the actual initial sort of starting point. And what came out of this was, and is in this paper, is that we have a large enrolment numbers in Australian universities. Not all students, when they graduate, will get jobs in the government jurisdictional ambulance services. And the information or the research findings actually noted that a number of the students were actually going into private sector. Well, private sector is not very large here in Australia, unlike in other areas of the world. And the students were, in some ways, felt as though they weren't a real ambulance person or paramedic by working in this sector, and also that they did not feel as though that they were quite as prepared, that the university didn't actually prepare them as well for the private sector like we were doing for the jurisdictional ambulance services or the state-based ambulance services here in Australia. So that was the main findings that sort of came out of it in that respect. But there was some benefits of actually working within the private sector. It managed to develop some of the interpersonal skills or emotional, social development of the actual graduates, built-in situational awareness when they're working in mass casualty and, well, mass crowd events like big festivals, some of the large footy events and that sort of thing. But they also found that they also sort of commented on the fact that it wasn't their end goal, it was just a stopgap.
So I think we all know now that Australia overproduces paramedics within the university program, and we see a lot of them going off to the UK. Certainly here in the US now, there is now starting to be a sort of trickle. We've got the E3 visa sorted out, for example, so we can start to have folk that come through and they challenge the national registry test and can start working here. So obviously this is another career option potentially before getting into the sort of the government run ambulance services. I'm interested in some of the sort of comments you made there about, the students didn't feel prepared to go and work in the private sector. How does the training and education differ from preparing someone to work privately as a paramedic, or indeed, dare I say, publicly as a paramedic?
Well, in the private sector, quite often the paramedic, the new graduates going out there, will only have a very short induction period, and then they'll end up working on their own. So they may only have 3 weeks of being adjusted, if that, into that period, and then they're on their own, basically, working in those areas. And they felt very underprepared because the university program had always prepared them for the internship programs that were going to be in the jurisdictional ambulance services, while all jurisdictional ambulances have their own little induction or internship idiosyncrasies, shall we say, and not two of them are actually the same, they still have a supportive environment where the students go in or the graduates go in and they are supported for quite a period of time, up to 3 to 6 months, with a more senior paramedic and to help them with those decision making. Whereas if they were going into the mining sectors, there was other things, other roles in that they need to undertake, like some of our mining sites and some of the students reported that they may have a patient for anywhere between 3 to 4 hours before they would be actually relieved of that patient. And so therefore, if you've got a person who's having a STEMI out on a mine site, you're now managing that particular STEMI patient for 3 to 4 hours. With limited resources, as in there's only one paramedic there.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting, of course, colleagues listening in the United States that are familiar with private ambulance services, the private sector, private equity organisations competing for business, running ambulance services. So this is probably a novelty to hear of the sort of Australian situation. So, in terms of this preparedness, then, what do you conclude needs to happen?
So I think what the universities need to do, there's a few things that we need to do. We need to look at our curriculum and look at more diversity into our curriculum for the coming roles that are now being developed here in Australia, like our mine sites where our students are, or the graduates, new paramedics out there are with patients for a lot longer period of times. They have to more extensive testing and understand, blood results more concisely, understand how to work, the ISTAT machines and various other pieces of equipment that they may have out there that they don't get to use now. And the other thing I think that really needs to happen within our curriculum or within the curriculum is diversification of our work integrated placements. So at the moment, 90%, or probably 98% of placements here in Australia with our paramedic students are done in the back of a jurisdictional ambulance. And depending on which university you are undertaking your studies with, that can be anywhere from 300 hours across the 3 years to 600 to 700 hours. So again, that depends on the university, but it's all done in the back of a jurisdictional ambulance.
And I'm kind of sticking to the output from universities, and we'll talk about kind of stigmas in a second. But interestingly, that colleagues in the UK and the College of Paramedics are now looking at creating graduate programs where they're actually training, because of mobile integrated healthcare, because of community paramedicine, because of other avenues of pre-hospital medicine, actually running a course where they're not even going to involve being on the truck, being on the ambulance, because of course there is, as these students are kind of inadvertently being, pushed into those wider, almost community paramedic, rural MIH roles, which traditionally you normally have to serve your time on the truck first, and then you graduate into these roles. But it sounds like this is kind of forcing the hand of the new graduate out into what would be considered very experienced community / paramedic roles.
And that's exactly what is happening because of the fact that whilst the most desired employment option for the graduates is the ambulance service, jurisdictional ambulance, as that's the desired role for them, there's not enough positions or jobs for the number of graduates that the number of universities in Australia are actually producing. For example, we have 5 universities in Queensland alone that are producing, 2,000 graduates per year. So then if you look at, there's about 5,500 graduates that are being produced out of Australia in any one year. So there's not that many jobs, unfortunately.
It's fascinating because what you've got accidentally happening there is where a lot of countries are actually looking to end at, not begin at. So almost you could say this is the perfect storm. But of course, there is that kind of, again, it's a national model, I guess, where people go into the government ambulance services first. You talk in your paper about, not real, quote, not real paramedic work. Well, first of all, from what you just said to me, it sounds damn well like real paramedic work. But why is that? Why do they hold that thought?
I the thought seems to have come through that it's not just like some of the mine sites, they don't see maybe quite the diversity of jobs and roles and that they would normally see in the back of an ambulance. If you're working out in a mine site, you're predominantly working with males. There's a small portion of females that work in the mine sites, but it's prominently, mid-20s to mid-50s males that you're working with out there. And then you're not seeing any pediatrics, you're not seeing any geriatrics, no obstetrics really. So you're not seeing that diversity. And you're really basically dealing with cough colds and other minor stuff on a daily basis, where the perception of most paramedic graduates when they first come into the university have this perception of the high acuity jobs, the trauma, the things that we see on the TV, the glorified stuff that we see in the media.
And we know it's not all blue lights.
Yeah, and so they they have this unrealistic expectation of what the actual job is, and then they go out and do these short placements purely in the back of an ambulance. So again, it's not the realistic, realism is not there. So they perceive it as not being real paramedic work. And then if they go to the footy or they go to the festivals and that sort of thing, they probably got maybe the odd drug overdose may occur, or there may be the odd intoxicated person. But then most of it, maybe I've got a blister, can I have a Band-Aid, please?
Well, this is a fascinating topic, and actually, this is why I volunteered to interview you, Lucinda, because obviously there's some interesting sort of juxtapositions between how different countries are setting up their system. But obviously, it's fascinating with your findings from the students coming out and the experiences they're having. So, by way of conclusion, what were your conclusions, your recommendations, potential policy changes, or indeed further work that you are suggesting?
Well, I think there needs to be a lot more research done in this area for a start off to actually understand how graduates actually transition into the workforce. What are the challenges in that they're faced in getting employment, and more research being done around the types of employment they're actually undertaking. Recent sort of looking at those sorts of things. This was a very small study at this stage, and it was just looking at those things. So the recommendation is basically we need to explore more. We need to do more research in this area to understand transition, and we need to actually explore what are the needs of the actual industry that's out there, the public sector as well as the private sector. So let's look at what are the needs and how can the universities, address those things. One of the findings was that, we don't prepare graduates to critically think well. Well, arguably in the literature, it says that critical thinking is a skill that not necessarily can always be taught in a classroom. It probably needs to be taught in the situation. And so that situational awareness. So I think more research has to be done and more research has to be understanding what are those components that is actually going to make it easier for graduates to transition not only into the public sector, but into the private sector, and what is the needs of the private sector, like the mines and these sorts of medical testing, drug testing, alcohol and drug testing that has to occur out in the mines. Well, this is not something we actually teach our graduates. That is where there's got to be further investigations as to what has to happen in those areas to make our graduates more employable. Just frozen again. And more employable, and to have the understanding of both the public sector, private sector, and the universities to get around the table and actually have those full-on discussions.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for joining us for this preview on the International Journal of Paramedicine. I commend that everybody reads the full paper. But also, this is a fascinating topic because there's so many sort of interacting issues here that have international ramifications. Whether it's the training, the education, the curriculum. As I said, over in the UK, they're thinking about not including the truck. I mean, there's some interesting sort of connotations here. But you certainly sparked my interest, and I know that this paper will spark the interests of our readers. So for now, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
No worries. Thank you very much, Rob. Nice to be here.